Robert Dairo had 82 films under his belt, plus 2 prestigious Oscars. He could have reigned forever among Hollywood's elite, yet his own mouth, reckless and overflowing with incendiary political tirades, destroyed every achievement he ever sculpted. His empire collapsed, new projects bombed at the box office, the media feasted on him, and his personal life unraveled. Is this the cost for speaking with no filter? At 81, he is now facing a career crisis more unsettling than anything he has ever experienced. It all began with one sentence, a verbal grenade hurled into the hot, sticky air on a June evening in 2024. Robert Dairo sat before a camera, recording a message about the upcoming presidential election, and what he blurted out was like a blazing fire ignited in the political sphere. "He's so blatantly stupid," he said in a low, growling voice, each syllable loaded with contempt. "He's a punk, a dog, a pig, a con artist, a mutt who doesn't know what he's talking about. I'd like to punch him in the face." He aimed these words at Donald Trump, and he didn't hold back. As soon as the video went online, it exploded, gaining millions of views within hours and shared by everyone who saw him as a champion against a bully. Back then, Dairo was practically untouchable. Goodfellas, The Godfather, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull. He had shaped a legacy of respect spanning decades. He could say anything, and the world would listen. But time moved on, and Dairo never cooled his jets. He stood on the Tony Award stage, lights glaring, the crowd on the edge of their seats. He was introduced as a living icon, a force of nature on the big screen, and he approached the microphone like someone who knew his own greatness. "I'm going to say one thing," he declared, pausing just long enough to electrify the room. His tone was controlled, but it carried an undercurrent of defiance. "Fod Trump!" The audience erupted. Some were stunned, some thrilled, many jumping to their feet in roaring applause. "It's no longer down with Trump," he declared, feeding the excitement. "It's Trump." Every moment was caught on camera and broadcast to countless people, lighting up social media. He strutted off stage, head held high, as if he had scored a monumental triumph. Yet, in reality, that night steered him toward real trouble. He had expressed his disdain for President Trump before, but this time felt sharper, more dangerous, and almost like the universe decided to give him a brutal lesson. His life fell apart soon after those words broke loose. This wasn't a fleeting storm or a tough spell. It turned into a drawn-out nightmare that pried away everything he had spent a lifetime creating. The first sign of disaster appeared quickly, just a few weeks after that rally rant. Rumors made the rounds in Hollywood. Dairo, once a towering figure whose very presence sold tickets and demanded attention, began to feel an icy shift. Studio executives who once revered him started ignoring his calls. His agent, Paul, a wiry presence who had been with him since the Raging Bull days, started sounding on edge during phone calls. "Bob, it's nothing personal," Paul insisted one afternoon in July, his voice cracking over the line as Dairo gazed at the sprawling city view from his New York penthouse. "It's just that everyone's super touchy right now. That Trump stuff, it's got people all wound up." Dairo's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles whitened, and he barked back, "What? They're angry I spoke the truth. Let them be mad." He slammed the phone down, seething inside, even as a flicker of unease stirred in his gut. He had fought his whole life, but this time it felt like invisible fists were striking from all sides. That unease burst into a roaring flame once the Alto night took shape. It was a $45 million high-stakes gamble meant to resurrect Dairo's slumping stardom, an ambitious bet where he'd portray not one, but 2 mob bosses in a single film. Anticipation soared, especially for fans who remembered the blazing brilliance he once brought to Goodfellas and Casino. Warner Brothers Studio, desperate for a blockbuster, thought it was a risk worth taking. But when the opening weekend earnings emerged, the dream shattered with a deafening crash. A paltry $3.2 million from 2,651 theaters, a humiliating $1.26 average per screen. Globally, it crawled to just $5 million, leaving a $40 million crater before marketing expenses were even added. It was a devastating blow to a star who once seemed invincible. This wasn't merely a flop, it was a catastrophe that underscored a grim reality. The king of the mobster genre was in freefall, and there was no parachute. The warning signs had been building for a while. In Hollywood's inner circle, people whispered that Dairo was poisoning his own success with incendiary speech. He had been a household name capable of locking audiences in quiet awe, Yet now the atmosphere around him was sour. His agent Paul repeated, "Bob, it's not personal," but Dairo's internal alarm had already been triggered. The Alto Night, with its $45 million budget, was supposed to confirm his enduring flair, but as soon as it landed, it crumbled in the harsh light of public judgment. It became obvious that he was no longer that unstoppable force who once drew huge crowds solely with his name. The film itself had its own problems. He wore thick layers of makeup to play these two mobsters and boomed lines such as, "I'm a gangster, that's it, that's the life," but it all felt awkward, almost humorous. Online chatter turned vicious, with people on X mocking it, saying it was basically Dairo screaming at his own reflection. Critics pounced as well, hitting it with a 38% Rotten Tomatoes score and labeling it a stale imitation of a genre Dairo had already conquered. Even a 70% audience score felt meaningless, an inflated number buoyed by a small knot of devoted fans, while masses simply stayed away. Some believed the seeds of this blunder were sown years prior, as Dairo's off-screen fury outshined his on-screen prowess. By 2024, he was at a boiling point, raging publicly at Donald Trump and his supporters, hurling statements like, "I'd like to punch him in the face," about Trump. So, with the Alto Night failing spectacularly, Dairo lashed out again instead of receding to regroup. He went off in Variety with an unhinged rant, fuming, "I think it's pretty obvious where the know-it-all critics are coming from against our film that focuses on the life of a gangster. It becomes far too obvious that we know now that we are dealing with a MAGA crowd that has one mission in mind, and that is to ruin cinema and to ruin entertainment for others that want to see a great piece of art such as the Alto Nights, which I think was a privilege to be a part of this great film." His defiant words sounded more like desperation than a powerful stand. Then he went further, "It really is all Trump's fault that cinema is dying before our very own eyes." He wanted the world to blame someone else for his downfall. The reaction was swift and merciless. The internet lit up with hostility, with one critic saying, "He's blaming Trump for a movie nobody wanted to see." Another wrote, "Dairo lost it. And so has his audience." The sting of that public disapproval ran deeper than he anticipated. This was no longer limited to folks in the MAGA crowd. He had angered a broad audience. Even poll data backed it up. A YouGov poll in early 2025 found that 62% of Americans now held a negative opinion of Dairo, a huge drop from the 78% who loved him a decade prior. Streaming numbers for his classics, The Godfather Part 2 and Raging Bull, plunged 34% since 2020 according to a Nielsen report, with many viewers saying they couldn't separate the actor's off-screen bitterness from his earlier masterpieces. One X comment captured the sentiment, "I hear him call me scum every time I try to watch Goodfellas." It was like a flashing warning light he failed to notice until it was too late. He had already stumbled with his 2024 Netflix series 0 Hour, which barely registered on anyone's radar despite his repeated calls for public support. Producers had implored him to drop the politics when promoting it, but he just couldn't resist doubling down on his attacks on Trump. Then along came the Alto Night, which showcased the peak of his self-destructive pattern. Warner Brothers, already suffocating from a loss exceeding $60 million on that film once marketing costs got tossed in, finally cut him loose. According to The Hollywood Reporter, they cited his waning star power in a move that felt cold but also fated. It was a jarring contrast to how Goodfellas brought in $47 million in 1990, over $100 million adjusted for inflation, while the Alto Night didn't come close to a fraction of that. Fans grieved the downfall of a legend, as if he was determined to dig his own grave. Even more heartbreaking was that Dairo, at 81, was oblivious to his own decline. He still viewed himself as an untouchable icon, sharing with Variety that, "The Alto Nights is a film that I had to sacrifice a lot of my time to invest in these very complex characters that really deliver the life of a gangster to the big screen." Reality, however, told a different story. His age was apparent in each shot, and the double role, intended to mesmerize, felt more like a tired gimmick. Critics claimed both characters sounded like one thing, Dairo being loud and cranky. Viewers weren't sold. They openly asked why they should watch him play dual mobsters in 2025 when Casino had given them something far superior decades earlier, performed by a younger, hungrier Dairo. Audiences grew weary of repetitious performances, while Hollywood had no patience for his looming drama. He ended up lumped with other vocal celebrities, such as George Clooney and Alec Baldwin, who flung tirades that overshadowed any recent projects. Dairo's outcry about diversity, "What some studios are doing right now because of Trump is also frightening. They are afraid to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion didn't resonate when his own latest film bombed. The real issue wasn't politics at all, it was him. The flop didn't just leave a sting, it started a hemorrhage. The studio lost a fortune, and they let him know. "You're the reason," an executive hissed at him in a phone call, voice laced with condemnation. "People don't want to see you anymore." He hung up, stunned, powerless to protest as ticket sales continued their downward spiral. A few weeks later, The Alto Night disappeared from theaters altogether. It became the cinematic equivalent of a ghost, forgotten by everyone. Dairo had passionately pushed for that project, argued for every cent of the $45 million budget. Now, it lay in ruins, with the blame stuck to him like a target on his back. He started staying indoors, too embarrassed to face the sympathetic looks of friends or the sly grins of strangers. His old comrades tried to reach out. Scorsese left voicemails, Pacino sent messages, but he refused to respond. "What's there to say?" he asked the empty walls. "I'm finished." The towering figure who once sold out multiplexes was now a punchline, and that humiliation burned brighter than any of the fury he'd spewed. Then turmoil slammed into his family, hitting him with brutal force. On March 20th, his ex-wife Grace phoned with a tense, frantic edge in her voice, one he hadn't heard since their bitter divorce days. "Bob, the kids are getting letters," she said, footsteps echoing on her end of the call. "Hate mail, threats, garbage directed at you. They're scared." Dairo felt his stomach clench, cold sweat forming on his brow. His older children, Dina, Raphael, and the twins, had dealt with paparazzi and trolls before, but this time it felt uglier. Grace showed him photos of the letters. "Your dad's a traitor, hope he pays. Dairo's a dead man walking, watch your back." One aimed at his toddler daughter's nanny was even viler, "Tell Bobby his time's up." He stared at the threatening words, breathing shallow, mind racing. His youngest, just 2 years old, born late in his life to a woman he adored, was his reason for living. Now she was being targeted, too. He immediately called Grace back. "I'll fix this," he promised, but he had no clue how. This wasn't merely his fight anymore. His own flesh and blood was stuck in the crossfire of his big mouth. The threats kept coming. 2 days later, on March 22nd, a text arrived from an unknown sender, "You should have stayed quiet, Bobby." No name, no way to trace it, just a chilling message shining on his screen like a menacing omen. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity, heart racing, trying to guess who had sent it. A random hater? A furious ex-fan? Someone truly dangerous? He didn't reply because he had no idea what to say. But the words burrowed into his brain, feeding a creeping dread. He began triple-checking his locks, glancing behind him every time he stepped outside. The fearless man who played Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver was now genuinely afraid, and he despised himself for it. Still, it was impossible to ignore the oppressive shadow edging in on him. The final blow from Hollywood was swift and devastating. Warner Brothers, who once backed some of his greatest successes, delivered news that shook him to his core. They had a huge mob boss film slated for 2027, accompanied by a $20 million paycheck, a return to the roles he had embraced so perfectly in Casino and Goodfellas. It was the perfect opportunity to remind the world of his legendary stature. Then the call arrived. David Zaslav, the CEO, was blunt. "We're cutting you," he stated coolly. "You're too risky." Dairo repeated risky, with disbelief, but they pointed to his outspoken persona, those searing remarks that once garnered cheers but now left executives on edge. The production was cancelled entirely, and just like that, the $20 million vanished. He paced around his New York penthouse, his fists clenched. "Foolish," he murmured, his voice brimming with shock. "They're fools." He spent hours walking circles, wearing down the carpet, replaying the exchange in his head. He vowed to sue, called his lawyers, and demanded a fight, but in his heart, he realized it was fruitless. Warner Brothers went further. They cut him from potential flashback scenes in Joker 3, a short but promising cameo, and removed him from a 2026 action flick as well. With each severed project, the phone rang less and less. On March 25th, he had a meeting with Paul at the Warner Brothers office in L.A. Paul avoided eye contact, fiddling with paperwork before he finally spoke. "They're letting you go, Bob," he said with no emotion. "The Alto Night bombed, and they've decided to be done. No more contracts, they're calling it a business decision." Dairo let out a sharp, bitter laugh that made Paul flinch. A business decision, after everything I gave them? Dairo practically snarled, leaning in on the table. I made them millions, and now I'm worthless. This went beyond a professional hiccup. It was like being shut out of the only life he'd known. The sting ripped deeper than he expected. He used to be the man who'd bounce back from any bomb, but now he found every door locked tight. He tried calling old friends, Scorsese, Pacino, people with whom he'd shared countless sets and memories. All he got was voicemail or polite excuses. I'm swamped on another project, one said. We'll catch up soon, said another. The soon never materialized. He scrolled through industry websites and saw his name used in headlines like Dairo's Fall, How One Rant Ended a Legend. Comments online were ruthless. He's a dinosaur. Time for him to retire. Nobody's into his gangster shtick anymore. He sat in his hotel room, curtains drawn, the TV babbling about something he could barely process, overshadowed by thoughts clattering in his mind. He had sacrificed a great deal for this career. Countless nights away from family, marriages wrecked beneath his grueling schedule, and a body battered by decades of intense roles. Now, it all slipped away, leaving him hollow, like a once glorious mansion stripped of furniture. The loneliness slammed into him like a runaway train. Other studios caught the same scent of trouble. Universal hinted they might drop him from an upcoming family film. Paramount dismissed a script he'd passionately pitched. He overheard someone labeling him toxic at a party, and the word sliced him open like a blade. Toxic. The actor who brought the world Travis Bickle and Vito Corleone, toxic? He couldn't wrap his head around that. In his office, he was surrounded by symbols of achievement. Oscars, Golden Globes, countless accolades from a career that spanned generations. Yet they felt like they were mocking him. The fear he tried so hard to crush began to grow, stoked by the guilt of seeing everything he once relied on slip through his trembling hands. Then that guilt became more than he could carry. His grandson Leandro was only 19, smart, funny, a young man with a bright future, until a single phone call turned Dairo's world dark. Dina, his daughter, spoke through ragged sobs. He's gone, Dad. Lo's gone. An overdose. Pills discovered in his apartment after it was too late. Dairo dropped the phone, numb. The family gathered for the funeral, but he couldn't bring himself to show up, paralyzed by the possibility of seeing Dina's accusatory eyes. He dreaded hearing them whisper behind his back that if he'd been around, maybe Leandro would still be alive. If I'd been there, he kept whispering, locked in a trance of self-blame, if I hadn't allowed this to overtake me. He couldn't finish that thought. It was too crushing. The press swooped in like vultures, displaying the tragedy on every front page. Dairo's neglect blamed for grandson's death, one bold headline thundered, while another shouted, family falls apart as actor obsesses, relying on anonymous sources, claiming he was too wrapped up in himself to see Leandro's troubles. The grief of losing his grandson was a deep, festering wound. He felt sure the world would show mercy, but it didn't. Public humiliation came swiftly, landing with the force of a sledgehammer. In May 2025, Dairo was on the verge of receiving a leadership award from the National Association of Broadcasters. He had spent weeks crafting a heartfelt speech, hoping it might restore some lost dignity. Then the phone rang, days before the ceremony. We're rescinding it, said a flat voice. Your comments and reputation are too controversial. He stood there, phone against his ear, feeling like the room was collapsing. That entire night, he remained glued in place, staring at his crumpled acceptance speech lying on the counter. The words he had planned to share seemed to mock him from the page. By morning, the story was everywhere. On X, the phrase, Dairo done, trended, side by side with old video clips of his meltdowns, turned into derisive memes. One widely shared post read, Trump nah, you Bobby, gathering thousands of likes. He saw it on his laptop, each remark jabbing him anew. People mocked him, calling him washed up and out of touch. Meanwhile, The War Can't Fix, his latest directing and starring project, had impacted theaters like a comet that disintegrates without a trace. Released in late 2024, it was a muddled political drama revolving around a fractured America. It grossed a measly $12.3 million worldwide against a $65 million budget, according to Box Office Mojo. Critics savaged it, and Rotten Tomatoes slapped on a 23% approval rating, with Variety branding it a preachy, incoherent mess that wastes Dairo's gravitas. Viewers stayed away by the masses, leaving it with a pitiful $4.8 million opening weekend, pale in comparison to The Irishman's $55 million debut in 2019, as reported by the numbers. This wasn't just a misfire, it was like a ceremonial beheading of Dairo's cinematic esteem. Robert Dairo's name alone was once a hallmark of intense, layered performances. From his deeply troubled portrayal of Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver to the chilling Jimmy Conway in Goodfellas, he spent decades stacking up a mighty empire that included 82 films, 2 Oscars, and a worldwide box office haul of over $5 billion, according to IMDb data. Directors like Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola relied on him to be their anchor. But the 21st century wasn't so kind. Since 2000, his filmography had swollen with numerous failures. Dirty Grandpa, 11% on Rotten Tomatoes, The Family, 28%, and Grudge Match, 31%, each one dragging him deeper away from his golden era. By 2025, The War Can't Fix served as the ultimate evidence of his creative collapse, a film so confused it couldn't even latch onto the volatile political divide it hoped to examine. Dairo's decline wasn't purely about flops or late-night rants, it was an ongoing erosion of trust. His obsession with Trump, which initially felt righteous, had transformed into a ridiculous spectacle. This is a dangerous person. This is a stupid person, and that's a bad combination, he proclaimed on Kimmel, his face seared with rage. The more he unleashed these outbursts, the less he resembled the composed powerhouse from Heat, and the more he seemed like a mirror image of Trump's own outbursts. "I think he has derangement syndrome about us too," he once admitted, apparently failing to see the comical irony. The stats offered a grim narrative. His last real success, The Irishman, was 6 years behind him, an outlier in a decade of disappointments. Ever since then, his average Rotten Tomatoes score sank to 34%, a drastic tumble from the 87% he enjoyed in the 70s and 80s. His draw at the box office cratered. The $12.3 million total of The War Can't Fix was a 94% drop compared to Meet the Parents' $330 million haul in 2000, when adjusted for inflation. Studios once ready to pour money into his personal projects now kept their distance. "He's become a liability," an unnamed executive told The Hollywood Reporter in January 2025. "Audiences just don't care anymore. He comes off like an outdated figure yelling about politics, not an actor." In contrast, some of his peers managed to hold on to their dignity. Al Pacino, at 84, still earned respect by choosing roles carefully, like The Irishman and House of Gucci. Jack Nicholson stepped away from the spotlight in 2010, but he ended gracefully with The Departed. Robert Dairo, now 81, continued swinging for the fences and repeatedly missing. His crusade against Trump, once a proud battle cry, had devolved into a shaky foundation. "I felt I had to speak out, to make it clear where I stand," he told Kimmel, defending his harsh words, "but to what end?